Real stories, expert insights, smarter decisions.
Some families are sharing Netflix subscriptions, you're sharing spreadsheets and investing strategies.
I think it's a pretty common origin story for a lot of young Australians now, especially millennials, Gen Z, that look at the Sydney market.
When you move out your own back garden, you're allowed to pick markets that are outperforming other markets. Let's take, Sydney or Queensland or Brisbane. These are arguably landlocked markets in the sense that we can't really go any further in urban sprawl.
Then after property 3, you find out you're having a child.
Yeah.
Well, necessarily you're going to railroad that goal. That goal's not actually going to come true. So you do need to bake in some element of optionality into that to give yourself that flexibility.
People make it sound complicated, but it's really not. It's just going, okay, instead of buying in my back garden, I've got the whole of Australia to play with. What market at any given time is performing the best?
Tune in and find out.
Well, g'day everyone. My name is Liam Garman and I am the editor of Smart Property Investment, and welcome to episode 2 of Inside Residential Property. And today we're joined by residential property expert James Thomson. James, it's great to have you on the podcast. How are you going?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. So first debut. Hopefully I do a good job and maybe I make it on a couple more today.
Okay, so you and I were talking before the podcast. I never got the chance to ask you because I thought it'd be funner to do it on air. Novocastrian?
No.
It's somewhere up northeast.
No.
Northeast England. Oh, whereabouts are you from?
Where am I from?
Where are you from?
In the UK.
In the UK.
I'm from Birmingham.
Birmingham. Well, I got the opposite side of the country.
Yeah, completely
points
wrong.
for trying. I was just picking random points on the map.
100%.
So tell me a little bit about
I was also
yourself.
thinking Australia straight away. Then I was like, well,
that is true. That is confusing because you and I were talking about buying units in Newcastle just before we started recording.
We were indeed, yeah.
So I set you off on a little bit of a tangent there. But talk to me about your history. How long have you been involved in property broadly?
So broadly, I'd say my whole entire life, parents were into property, and then let's say over the past decade, I've always been and worked around property, from doing multi-lot subdivisions development in Victoria. And then about 5-6 years ago, I kind of took a vertical step and went into actual buyer's agency work. So always been a buyer's agent. Originally owner-occupier, and then moved a couple of years ago into my passion, which is more the investment side. I'm better with numbers.
That's fantastic. So how many clients roughly have you helped on their journey in investing?
Look, the exact number of clients would be hard to say, but it would be well into the hundreds. And, over my time, I've purchased hundreds of $1 million worth of properties. So it's been quite a journey so far.
And we're going to be diving into one of your clients that you've been supporting on his investing journey. And I think he's actually calling right now. Charlie, you have now joined in. Mate, how are you going? You're joining us remotely.
Yes. Thanks for having me, guys.
So, look, Charlie, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do for a crust?
So I'm an engineer. I'm about 3 years out of uni, and yeah, loving it.
So tell us about your origin story. What got you into residential property investing?
During COVID, I had a bit of spare cash. Was looking at I dabbled in the share market, mixed results, and then decided to launch into my first investment property. My family had done well with principal places of residence, and obviously I couldn't afford anything in Sydney, so I decided to leave Sydney and find an investment outside.
I think it's a pretty common origin story for a lot of young Australians now, especially millennials, Gen Z, that look at the Sydney market, increasingly so Brisbane as well, increasingly Melbourne, that they don't have necessarily the opportunity to start their property journey by buying in those areas that they traditionally would have, near family, near friends. Just as some insight into your property portfolio at the moment, Charlie, can you give us a 60-second summary of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2021, drove out to Wagga, found a place out there, bought it. 3 years passed. I moved out with a couple of friends. The equity built. I then moved home, did a cash out refinance after my borrowing capacity had increased. I'd finished uni by now, so I was working in a full-time job. My girlfriend was also looking at investing in a property, so we combined our resources and bought another place in the Central Coast. Another year since then, very recently, we've used equity and a bit of cash and bought up in the Hunter region.
That's fantastic. Now, looking at the numbers, What's working, what didn't necessarily work, and what's next on your journey?
So yeah, just trying to maintain cash flow and growth. Currently, the Wagga Wagga place is probably the best cash flowing. Central Coast second, and because we've only just bought the Hunter one, the cash flow is probably just a little bit lower. Looking to continue on that path, although now that we've moved out again, the cash flow and the borrowing capacity is taking a bit of a hit. So feeling a little bit hamstrung there.
I kind of want to dig more into the actual portfolio and the decisions around it and why you made them. So, look, full disclosure, I had a quick chat with Charlie last week before we jumped on here. So, I kind of know the backstory, and there's definitely some very interesting parts I want to talk about. So, Charlie, let's talk about what led you to that first purchase in Wagga Wagga.
Yeah, so I was working 2 jobs during uni. I was working at a pub, and my course made me do an internship that I ended up keeping. So I was working a fair bit, and then COVID hit, so had a fair bit of cash just sitting on the sidelines. About back then it was a bit easier. 25 grand, bought a $187,000 property. The cash flow on it was good. I wasn't up for anything for the mortgage, and I thought it was a good entry, pretty risk free. And the growth hadn't quite kicked off from all the surplus or the work from home payments.
Yeah, okay. No, that's some really good numbers. But how did you actually land on? We discussed this before. Wagga Wagga itself. What was your process? Were you working with any professionals? How did you actually land on that suburb?
Being from New South Wales, I felt a bit more comfortable investing in New South Wales. I had a few areas on the short list, so I was looking around, Maitland and Dubbo and Orange and Mudgee and those sorts of areas that are, come up pretty commonly in conversation. I've had a bit of a criteria, hospital, university, just sort of infrastructure, and just kind of whittled it down until I found a property that worked for me.
Did you use a BA for that, or did you do it yourself?
I did it myself. Buyer's agent cost $10,000. My deposit was 25, so I couldn't quite swing buyer's agent. So and I was happy to do the research myself. To be honest with you, found it quite enjoyable.
Charlie's raised some really good points here. Looking Wagga Wagga, where he obviously bought, compared to Maitland, and you even mentioned Dubbo. Question for yourself, James. We are entering an era where a lot of investors are going into regional areas just as they're priced out of metros. What makes a good regional area versus what makes potentially a less good regional area for investing?
So I think when it comes to regional areas, the main things is the surrounding infrastructure. Is it close enough still to a large CBD? And the other side of it, is it a regional hub? Because you can have regional areas which are small country villages, and they're small economies based on whatever it might be in that area, farming, dairy, anything in between. But then you have regional hubs. You look at, let's say, Bendigo or Ballarat and Victoria, and these are areas where they're pretty substantial towns, and they've still got good transport networks where you're getting into Victoria, into Melbourne itself. So it really is, you need a good mixture of industry, and you still need a strong central hub in a lot of these places. That's like the real high level stuff. There's other indicators that we look at, but just very simply, it can't just be, a place in the middle of absolutely nowhere with no kind of central business district anywhere near it.
And that's something that's turned off a lot of investors from looking into the regions. Going historically, I think every Australian's heard the stories of, hey, I bought into this small mining town where, yields were just fantastic because of all the FIFO workers or the workers coming in and out. And then suddenly the mine shuts and then the house price drops by 80, 90%. So those memories of the 2006, 2007, 8 era really do color a lot of people's investing thoughts. But now we are moving on to that era of arbitrage where you are moving out a lot of the major cities because you're simply priced out as an investor into these regional markets. But economic and financial diversity seems to be the key for that.
Yeah, like you said, the key word there was mining booms. So they're one industry towns. As soon as that industry goes up or down, for, reasons out of control, so are the property prices. So you need a few things going on in that town to keep it going in a very simple way. You can't just be relying on mining. You can't just be relying on farming, because if any of these drop off, you're going to quickly lose the value of your property. So making sure that there is quite a spread of opportunities and business types in that area.
Absolutely. Now, Charlie, Wagga Wagga worked out for you. Then you moved on to the Central Coast. Talk us through that purchase.
Yeah. So I managed to cash out a bit of equity from Wagga Wagga, and my partner came up with her half for it. We were looking for still decent growth, but again trying to maintain around a 5% rental return. So was looking around the Central Coast. There's quite a few house and granny flat options, and with our borrowing capacity at the time, we could afford something around the $1 million mark. And so, we found a place.
That's a huge jump.
Yeah, it's a huge jump from your 200K property up to pretty much $1 million. It's a 5x next purchase.
Yeah. A bit more responsibility, but a bit more opportunity. And I felt comfortable, with a good rental return. The numbers still work. So I did consider maybe we could find two $500,000 properties, but because we were looking at going traveling, we didn't have the time to make that work. So we decided on a $1 million place, found it renting for about $1,000 a week in total with the house and granny flat separately. And that one's been performing quite well. We've had a few not issues, but we've had to bring up the pool fence for compliance, redo the driveway for the back tenant, and put in an AC. So that one's kind of cost us a little bit, but we were still able to move on to the third property as well.
Well, that's just part and parcel of investing, right? Is that level of risk. So what I wanted to talk about is, what was the gap between that first property and the second property in years?
We went away after purchasing the second property, the Central Coast one. We went to Asia for 6 months and then came back. I was able to pull out another bit of equity from Wagga Wagga. After the recent rate drop, the first one, we were able to purchase a place up around Cessnock. So about 12 months.
About 12 months. Okay, so pretty quick. It's a big jump. And so how much equity did you manage to pull out of Wagga Wagga at that point?
So I took that one down. I took it down to 10% equity. I pulled out 78,000 from that. And then, we had to come up with another $15,000 between us to cover the rest.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Double tapping Wagga Wagga. You hear so much about the Wagga Wagga market, but to see it tangibly, just how much it's been foundational for your ability to scale. It goes back to those first principles, especially as a young investor. And it's very passionate for me to speak to millennial Gen Z investors that when you're starting off your journey, you do want to go to those areas which are giving you a good capital return to set you up for your future success. Charlie, you've had a very successful few years in your property investing journey. As you highlighted, that's a 5 times increase for the second buy that James said before. What are your comments to young Aussies about how they can start their property investing journey? What first steps should they be taking?
The first step would probably be speak to a mortgage broker. So you have a number that you can work towards. If you don't know what you can borrow, you don't really know what you should be looking for. And I think having a target to work towards, especially even just knowing what your borrowing capacity is, and then you can work towards your deposit as well.
And that leans into a really big topic that I want to discuss, which is, I don't know your balance sheet at the moment, but I would say that you might be getting to the point where you're hitting your serviceability limits. Looking at Charlie's history, he started off with $25,000 and a dream, but now scaling his portfolio, he's used a lot of the equity in his Wagga Wagga place, gone down to 10%. There is maybe a risk that a lot of banks would look at that and say, no more, you're at your limit. James, what does he do from here?
There's a number of different ways to unpack it, and I do want to loop back around to this, but I think I want to pick at Charlie's story a little bit more before we get to the bottom of it. So we've got first purchase, 2021, year later, Cessnock purchase. And then, so there was a third purchase that you did. And so essentially what we're looking at, the first purchase was your capital growth play. And then I don't know if this was intentional, but your $1 million purchase with a granny flat is despite it still having that capital growth, is a cash flow play. So you've almost balanced the portfolio going forward there. So what I actually want to understand is what the third move was. What was you thinking? Was it intentional, or was it just by like, you'd kind of heard something and you thought, oh, I want something with a granny flat. So run me through that first, please.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The first one, it did cash flow, and I was also hoping for a bit of growth there. But the second one, house and granny flat, was definitely more of a cash flow play, and just hoping that over time we'll start to build on that rental return. The third one, the Cessnock one, we purchased. It's a 810 square meter block. So we purchased with the intention to put a granny flat on. Doesn't currently have it. We rented it out for $635 a week, so it's about it's bang on 5%. And hoping that around this time next year we'll be able to put a granny flat on that, and again add to that cash flow.
Okay, perfect. And so when we spoke about this before, you're at a point now where, first of all, congratulations. You've got 3 properties. You're 26. That's a huge feat. Like, most people aren't getting into the market until their 30s right now, so you should be super proud of that. But now you're at this point where you still want to keep on growing the portfolio, but I believe you're stuck when it comes to your borrowing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've hit a ceiling. Our serviceability is at its limit. So I think that just kind of comes down to how I should have structured the portfolio early on. But, it's hard to know these sorts of things when you're just starting out.
Yeah, and you kind of went off and did it your own back, so that's fantastic for way. But maybe let's talk about a couple of different scenarios of how you might be able to move the portfolio forward. Or what I should say is what I've seen people do in a similar scenario to get themselves out of this stuck point. So I wrote down a couple of different options, but first and foremost, the easiest one is do nothing, right? Inflation will erode away the debt in the sense that the debt will be worth less. Your rents will go up, and then on top of that, hopefully your salary goes up. Who knows, right? If you play the waiting game, which let's face it, you've got time on your side. You're 26. If you even just sit on your hands for the next 2 to 4 years, you still might have your 4th property by the time you're 30. Which, wow, like that's huge either way. So that's kind of option number 1 that I see people doing these scenarios. But look, not always the best option because you're losing 2 to 4 years worth of potential growth on another asset you can buy. Second one, and I'm going to kind of go through these, the simplest ones to do is to sell off the least effective asset. So that doesn't necessarily mean the most expensive asset. It doesn't mean the asset that's providing most money. It means the asset that may be coming towards the end of its market cycle. And what I mean by that is, what's the growth at? Has it slowed down? By selling off that asset, you then could make a sidestep potentially into putting a different structure in place and then buying within that structure, which will allow you to keep on moving forward. Another one, you kind of mentioned it before, it's not something that I work with our clients, so there's a bit more risk in it, is the granny flat strategy, which is an equity building strategy. So can I renovate any of the properties for more, both cash flow when it comes to rent, can I rent them for more and build equity? And that can be applied to the property or a granny flat at the back. And then the final one, and this is still not an overly complicated one, but it's definitely one that people should always have a good understanding of with their, broker, their accountant, financial planner, is you can move your current asset or holdings straight into maybe like a trust structure. That's what I've seen a lot of people do, where they go, okay, well, I'm going to move the most expensive property, the one that I've got the most debt on, into a trust structure. And then you can essentially, a lot of the time, remove that debt from your name because it's a different legal entity, and then go back to your brokers and say, hey, this property's cash flowing, let's hide it off the sheet. I don't know if hide's the right word, but then you can go back and quite a lot of time release a lot of more purchasing power. But then you just need to make sure that your next purchases are going to be within some sort of separate legal entity from yourself.
Yeah, actually, that's something I've been trying to research a bit recently. Is the structuring of the portfolio and using using those structures to free up a bit of borrowing capacity. To be honest with you, I haven't got an accountant. The family one that we're using is no longer practicing. So yeah, I'm in the market for an accountant. Hopefully someone that can give me a hand with this sort of thing.
Raises a good point though, that you need to be surrounded by people that know what they're doing, and the accountant's a perfect example. You hear so many horror stories of people whose accountants simply don't know how to support property investors on their journey. And you see property investors, especially at 26, right? Every $1,000 really counts. Now, you might get to a point further down that might be a bit of a rounding error, but at this point in your portfolio scaling, you do have to hustle. James, for young Aussies like Charlie that need to build that team around them to keep going, you spoke about trusts. It can be getting quite technical. Who do they need to be surrounding themselves by to take that next step?
Look, I'm going to take it one step further and talk more about strategy. Charlie mentioned, a good broker. I do think that's key. But if you intend on being, you need to kind of decide what your goals are and what they are at that time. And can be very hard early on because you don't really know what you want at, a younger age. You just know you want to get into property, and that's all good. But once you start getting to property, purchase 1 or 2, you kind of do need to have a strategy in mind, because if you knew that you were going to be more aggressive earlier on, you could have put that trust in place or had the correct conversation with a broker. Most brokers will know about trust structures, company structures and everything in between. So I think having not a set plan, but a slight plan, just kind of a vision, is important. I think brokers are super key. And then just surround yourself with maybe somebody that knows a little bit about investing, which when I was speaking to Charlie before, he actually comes from a family of investors, which I want to hear a little bit more about because I found it very intriguing. So Charlie, why don't you just run me through that?
Yeah, so the family motto growing up was asset rich, cash poor. We moved a fair few times and took advantage of the capital gains tax-free scheme. It worked out, but it was stressful, not having the rental income for such a large asset. Similarly, aunties and uncles have also done well in property, as a lot of Australians have. And so, I was put in contact with a mortgage broker initially for the Wagga Wagga place that, might not have taken me as seriously. $187,000 purchase, might seem quite low. But when I was going for a cash out refinance, one of my friends put me in contact with a broker that was able to kind of, understand where I was heading. Gave me a bit more time of day, and he's helped us to go through the second property and the third property. So not necessarily getting the structures in place. Obviously, we're already on a bit of a trajectory, but and it is good having family members that understand, maybe not the same markets that I've been targeting, but the principles and the people to speak to, and especially dealing with real estate agents and other things of that nature. It's good to have people to kind of bounce things off.
Well, it sounds like you had that support, right? Because one thing that a lot of young generations, millennials, come across is, parents that are all about buying where they live. You got to buy the house that you live in. Whereas it sounds like your parents are all for, essentially this rent vesting strategy, knowing that you were priced out in the market. And now tell me, Charlie, because this made me laugh. From what I understand, between you and your family, you own half of Wagga Wagga at this point.
That's right. Yeah. Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Mum's, pretty keen on the rinse and repeat strategy. So, Wagga's worked out for me. My sister, I'm one of 5 kids, so my sister has recently purchased, and then younger than her, my other brother and sister have purchased another one together. So yeah, still one.
So 4
one
out
to
of
go,
5 siblings have purchased in
right.
Wagga Wagga. Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
whereas some families are sharing Netflix subscriptions, you're sharing spreadsheets and investing strategies. I'd love to be a part of the family WhatsApp chat.
Makes for some fun dinner conversations. Absolutely.
So if anything goes wrong, you're the one that they're going to blame as well.
Yeah, I guess so.
Now, that's fantastic. James, did you have any more points to ask Charlie before we unpack his strategy?
No, Charlie, I think we pretty much covered everything off. And like, just again, congratulations. You know, it's a huge accomplishment on such a young age. And I think even if you were to do absolutely nothing for a while, you're well ahead of the game. So it's one thing to keep in mind. And despite your borrowing capacity being capped at the moment, there still is options to keep you moving forward, even if it means that you have to sit on your hands for a year or two. So really, congratulations.
Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for having me on. It's very enjoyable to be able to discuss the portfolio.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, mate.
Now, James, we have the opportunity to unpack all of Charlie's moves and his portfolio growth strategy. One key thing that I'd love to get your insights on, obviously, Charlie started his strategy 5 years ago. 2020 is a very different market to 2025. How can a young Australian start their property journey with such a conservative pool of money?
Yeah, okay. And look, that's one of the key things here is Charlie wasn't going for a $500, $600, $7,000 property, $700,000 property. He has saved up a good portion of money for his time, and then with the mindset to get into the market. So, you know, $20,000 is still a lot of money, but the main lesson there is Charlie got into the market as soon as he could, and then the market did the rest of the work. So for Australians that are looking to get in the market, yes, properties are a lot more expensive. And, you know, you look at Sydney prices, you look at Melbourne prices. You shouldn't be aiming to get into these markets, right, if you don't have the money. But if you've got now, you know, anywhere between, let's say, 50 to 100K, probably less, there are a lot of strong regional markets that you could get a foothold in, and you're going to outpace what you would be able to save. And that's kind of a really key lesson, is just getting in the market as early as possible, because Charlie's got options now. That's the main thing. And when the earlier you get in, the more options that you have.
Charlie was fantastic in the sense that he did the research himself. He went online, he used the expert opinion of members of his family, but also that research, the professional education aspect of it, right? Which is why a lot of people watch podcasts like this, to understand what are those key characteristics that I should be looking out for in an area or in a different asset class. Obviously, before we touched on the financial economic diversification of a regional town, not buying those one-horse towns or those one industry towns which are more exposed to greater risk of economic downside. When looking at a postcode or looking at a region or looking at an LGA, what are some of those other characteristics, some of those other economic fundamentals that people should be looking at?
Okay, well, I'll keep it real high level so, you know, anybody can take this. There's a couple of things. There's the type of people that live there. I quite often make the joke, you know, I'd prefer to have a load of hipsters in town than grannies. I want somebody spending too much money on coffee. It's good for the economy, rather than, you know, retirees that aren't really spending their money. Outside of that, infrastructure is always a big indicator. And then the final, just to keep it real high level, is always that demand. And you have to be careful when it comes to supply and demand, because you can have high demand, but then you can equally have as much supply pick up. And the easiest way that people can determine this at home is, you know, what is the market doing? How long are the properties on the market? How many building approvals are in that area? And these are all very simple numbers and statistics that you can find out on most free sources. And it's, you know, very simply, we human beings, we make the market, right? So there's demand in that area, but what are the demands in that area? What are the lifestyle drives in that area? Making sure, you know, okay, we spoke about mining booms. Is there demand because it's a mining boom? Is it one of those? Because that shouldn't be the only metric. So what else is that economy doing? What are the kind of people in there? And then also getting an understanding of, okay, well, how much potential land is there to be developed there? Is there a lot of subdivision developments going on? What's the rental market like? Because sometimes when we look at places and they're rapidly growing, particularly in today's age, it's very hard. It's very expensive and it's very hard to build a property. Even with this housing shortage and crisis we're always hearing about, the cost to build a property is still quite substantial. So when you look at a market, let's take, Sydney or Queensland or Brisbane, these are arguably landlocked markets in the sense that we can't really go any further in urban sprawl, and the areas immediately surrounded us are either national parks or water. So there also needs to be kind of an element of common sense, like how much opportunity is there to keep on providing property at a later point. Yeah,
it is ultimately a scarce resource. It's a finite resource, and on the flip side, looking at the supply demand aspects, there are swathes and swathes of Sydney where property prices actually haven't increased with the on supply of new units. And I think the best example that I can give with this is with the Parramatta market, where you compare sold prices 10 years ago. They're identical to what it is now for some of those new build units. That's obviously a very extreme example, but this is case in point with the supply and the demand. When you do have reams of new supply coming on board, it doesn't necessarily give you that capital uplift. So when you're looking at regional areas, there are a lot of regional areas where you do have new supply coming on board, and those aren't necessarily the LGAs where you're going to be parking your money. Now, obviously, you do have caveats to that. Sometimes it can add new buoyancy to an area. Sometimes it can add economic uplift to the area. Other times it just oversupplies the market and you do see prices drop. So it's an incredibly important thing to factor in, especially for people that aren't using buyer's agents and they're charting their own journey in terms of investing. Now, again, half a decade ago for Charlie is very different to now. What would you do differently? Might be a bit personal. What would you do differently in Charlie's journey if Charlie was back to his 21-year-old self?
Yeah, and look, I kind of had this discussion with Charlie, and so there is a couple of different things. Probably first and foremost, and we did discuss although there was an element of research, there was also a slight element of luck. So the huge uplift in the Wagga Wagga apartment property is what allowed for the portfolio to keep on growing. But if you actually look at that journey, is Charlie bought into the backyard of his own market, which is what a lot of people do when they don't know the market. So if you work, for example, and I know I'm kind of selling my own story here, but if you remove the buyer's agent aspect and let's say you were going to just buy sight unseen yourself and go Australia-wide, when you move out your own back garden, you're allowed to pick markets that are outperforming other markets. And this is where the constant story, the rent vesting, these ongoing stories that we hear, people make it sound complicated, but it's really not. It's just going, okay, instead of buying in my back garden, I've got the whole of Australia to play with. What market at any given time is performing the best, right? Because they all do market cycles. And what's really important is getting the upward swing of a market cycle early on, because when you actually look at the numbers of property over 20 years, most properties will perform relatively the same when it comes to growth. But if you buy early on in an upward swing, you're going to get that equity to keep on growing that portfolio a lot quicker. So I think I'm just going to go through the key points for Charlie is having that team, that professional team that could have advised on structures, kind of having a bit more of a goal in place. Somebody should have been there after the second property to go, how big do you want to make this thing? You're very young, you've got a lot of time. There needs to be some potential structures in place. Having the resources, whether it's working with a professional or the know-how of how to invest across Australia rather than just in your own back garden. And then I suppose the next thing that we apply is, I don't know if Charlie meant to do it, but it's also people get fixated on goals like 5 properties or 5 years. We discussed this before, where it's really just kind of something that you hear, but you can kind of get to a goal or a stage within your buying where you just need to be making variations or iterations to keep you moving forward. And what I mean by that, and what Charlie did well, is he bought a capital growth property, then he bought a cash flow property, then he bought a capital growth. So as the portfolio grows, you just need to keep in mind that the goal is maybe more of a phase. So Charlie's in his accumulation phase. he's not in his 5 or 10 property phase. He's just in an accumulation phase. And everything that happens between that initial point and that end goal just is different iterations or variations of how to keep him moving forward and keep that portfolio growing. And I like to say this, but when you acquire these assets and keep use structures in place, it's all about options. So you're keeping your options open. Charlie, at his age, has a lot of options in the future. He could just sell down and completely start again right now. And he would still be way ahead of most of the market. So there's so many different lateral steps that Charlie can take. And I think that's just really important. A part of that, again, just to go full circle, is having people there, whether they're professionals or just people that have done it, that have ran that race.
The goal setting aspect is really important because we are I think it's reasonable to say there are a lot of finfluencers around. We're on a podcast, so maybe, you point the finger at someone else and throw you pointing back at you. But what you see a lot on Instagram is you highlighted it, the kind of amorphous goals of, buy 5 in 5 years, and you think that that's your threshold for achieving. Well, it might not be. That's kind of a hook, or the hooks around maybe passive income, or hooks around buying minimum this, maximum that. It's not the same for everyone, right? If you're 50 years old and you're looking for retirement, you're saying, well, I've got 15 years to go. That's going to be a very different strategy to someone in Charlie's shoes who can take a little bit more risk, and he can potentially go into markets which at 50 you might not be best suited for it. Goal setting is obviously easier said than done. A lot of people in the world of property think that it's a get-rich-quick scheme. You saw 3 years of 20+% returns on Perth, and there are going to be Aussies who lucked out, maybe bought in Sydney, then migrated all their assets to Brisbane, then migrated all their assets to Perth. And then maybe after 6-7 years, they are in a position where they can retire very comfortably. Realistically, that's not 90% of property investors, and you can't compare yourself to the top 10%. So having long-term goals is very important. You work with a lot of young Aussies, a lot of Aussies across Australia. How do you form goals? How do you get them to structure their goals and actually stick to them? Because sticking to them is probably 50% of the battle, because everyone makes their goals and then they realize, like, well, I can sell down all my assets and get a really cool owner occupier, maybe cut off their nose to spite their face. How do you go about setting goals, and how do you go about keeping to your goals?
Yeah, okay. It's a great question. And you kind of hit the nail on the head of what you said, like with a retiree. It's two very different strategies. And again, that word is options depending on where you're at in your life. Charlie, lots of options. 50-year-old with, who needs to quickly accumulate wealth, not as many options. And I just want to pull back on the word goal, because I want to usually use that word, and it fits into what we're saying, is there is a goal, but that goal is about your point of life and what you're trying to accomplish there. So 50-year-old probably needs more cash flow, right? 30-year-old, in most cases, they're in their wealth accumulation. So rather than having this fixed goal, and that's what I'm saying is 5 property in 5 years, why is, okay, I'm in the accumulation phase. My goal is to accumulate wealth over these next few years. I'm getting paid well. I'm low risk. Maybe, there's kids or whatever on the way in the future. So what happens then is, whilst you have the goal of, I want to accumulate wealth, which is the stage that you're in, this is going back, and I said it before, is then every part of the next part of the strategy. So each purchase is a part of that goal, but it has to change, because you might be in the wealth accumulation phase, but at some point you might need to be getting more of a cash flow property because you're stuck. So it really is about understanding where you're at in maybe your own life, how much risk you can take. And that's what gives you options. And that's how you actually stick to your goals, which is just having that understanding of where you're at. Because if, like you said, if somebody close to retirement age called me up and goes, I want 5 properties in 5 years, just we've been using that ongoing example, I'd be thinking, well, when are you going to retire? Like, you're going to be selling these properties for a while. they're an equity growing asset, they're not a cash flowing asset. So it's just about having that understanding of where you're at.
So on the flip side, take introspection on what I was saying before about people needing to stick to their goals. You also do need to bake in that element of flexibility. And that element of flexibility, you and I were talking about it before we started this podcast, which is you can have those 5 properties in 5 years kind of tagline and you're going to it. But then after property 3, you find out you're having a child. Yeah. Well, necessarily you're going to railroad that goal. That goal's not actually going to come true. So you do need to bake in some element of optionality into that to give yourself that flexibility.
Yeah, 100%. You've hit the nail on the head there.
Now, given Charlie's scenario and his amazing 5 years in the property market, is there anything else that we can glean from his 5 years?
Charlie started young. He got in the market early, which is great. He used his partner, not used, but he teamed up with his partner to keep his portfolio growing forward. I hear a lot of people say that they wish they'd got their partner involved sooner. Because, there's many different ways you can get better borrowing. And then he's at a point where he's recognized that he's at a standpoint, and rather than just giving up, he's gone, okay, well, how can I keep on moving this forward? Because a lot of people also don't have that mindset. They're like, oh, I'm at my borrowing capacity. Whereas there's always ways to move around it. So is
there a risk that people can go into alternative structures like trusts too soon?
There is always a risk when it comes to that. That's more something that you kind of is person to person dependent. It's definitely more of a financial planner's conversation. But if, for example, you get less borrowing capacity a lot of the time in a trust structure than you do your personal name. So if you're just scratching at the market, you barely have enough to get in a trust structure, then it might be better off going to a personal structure and then later on just copying paying what you'd have to pay to transfer that property to a new legal entity. With any of these scenarios of how to grow a portfolio, they are unique to each individual. So we got to remember this isn't financial advice. It's just strategies that we've seen that's worked for clients in the past. And rather than, you can listen to these and think about them, but you should always be running anything by an appropriate professional, whether that's your accountant, your financial advisor, or a mortgage broker. And so look, just to round it off, if we were to put Charlie's playbook in action in 2025, these would probably be my main points to do. So get an early understanding of what your goals are or where you're at with your strategy. Okay. Are you in the accumulation phase? Are you in, your cash flow phase? Secondly, shop in more than just your back garden. Get around, get out there, see what's available. And that also ties into my next point, which is, you don't have to have all the money to buy a property. See what you can afford. And if you're excited to get into the market, then look at where you can get into as soon as possible because the market will do the lift. And lastly, just make sure you're working with a good broker and you have an understanding of how it is that you're going to buy and how you're going to keep on scaling that portfolio.
Thank you so much for joining us on our second episode of Inside Residential Property. Now, if you liked the episode, make sure you subscribe and send the episode to your friends. If you're interested in scaling your property portfolio, make sure you subscribe to see more episodes, and they'll be coming up very shortly.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.